Picture this. It's the summer of 1989. The air in Beverly Hills is thick with money and privilege. We're talking about a world of private schools, country clubs, and a sprawling $7 million Spanish-style mansion. Inside this house lives a family that, from the outside, has it all. The powerful entertainment executive father, the socialite mother, and their two good-looking sons, Lyle and Erik Menendez. A perfect American dream. But on the inside, it was a nightmare of control, fear, and a dark secret that festered for years. Then, on the night of August 20th, 1989, that dream was shattered. The parents, Jose and Kitty Menendez, were brutally executed in their own den. Not by a professional hitman, not by a random intruder, but by their own flesh and blood. The two boys who cried to the police, the two boys who looked like they were victims of a cruel twist of fate, were the actual killers. How could two young men, raised in such luxury, plan and commit such a vicious, cold-blooded act? Was it purely for the $14 million inheritance? Was it years of abuse finally boiling over? Or was it a deadly, unhinged combination of both? Tonight, we peel back the layers of this infamous case. We'll trace the shocking crime, the months of reckless, panicked spending, the slow unraveling of their perfect lie, and the sensational trial that laid bare the darkest secrets of the American elite. This is the story of the heir who murdered his family for the inheritance. The clock on the wall of the den had just ticked past 10 o'clock on a warm Sunday night. Lyle, the older brother at 21, stood in the doorway, his heart pounding a chaotic rhythm against his ribs. Erik, 18, was right behind him, his face a ghostly pale mask of terror and forced resolve. They wore gloves and stood in the shadow of the hallway, holding the weapons that would forever define their lives. Two 12-gauge shotguns, purchased barely a week earlier in a desperate attempt to make this plan real. Their parents, Jose and Kitty, were in the large, plush den, winding down after a quiet dinner. Jose, the formidable entertainment executive who had built a massive fortune, was on the couch, watching a movie. Kitty was sitting nearby, focused on a bowl of ice cream. The scene was domestic, mundane, almost peaceful, a stark contrast to the violence about to erupt. This ordinariness made the act they were about to commit even more monstrous. Lyle took a deep, shaky breath, giving a quick, almost imperceptible nod to Erik. It was the signal. Erik, who had seemed on the verge of collapsing just moments earlier, raised his shotgun. There was no argument, no final moment of conscience, just the cold, hard logic of their plan taking over. They had rehearsed this in their minds 100 times. Their parents needed to be gone. The first shot was aimed at Jose Menendez. It was a massive, deafening sound that blew the silence to shreds. The impact was instant and horrifying. Kitty screamed, a raw, primal sound of pure shock and pain. She scrambled from her seat, a desperate, confused movement that didn't help her escape. The second blast, fired by one of the brothers, hit her. The air was instantly thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. The initial ambush wasn't enough. In a panic, seeing their mother wounded but still moving, the boys pursued her as she tried to flee down a hallway. They fired again and again until both parents lay dead on the floor of the den. The brutality of the scene was shocking even to the young men who had created it. It was far messier, far louder, and far more final than their darkest imaginings. They dropped the shotguns and stood over their parents, two young men who were now the sole inheritors of a vast fortune, but also the sole bearers of a terrible, immediate secret. They had done it. Jose and Kitty were dead. The fear, the anger, and the resentment that had built up for years had finally erupted in a frenzy of violence. Now, the second phase of their plan had to begin, crafting the perfect lie. They had to make it look like a botched robbery, a professional hit, anything but patricide. They quickly wiped down the weapons, gathered the spent casings, and ran out of the house into the cool Beverly Hills night. They needed an alibi, a way to be seen somewhere else when the bodies were discovered. Their story was already prepared, a night out at the movies. Now they just had to live it. The game had begun. Lyle and Erik drove their car away from the mansion, trying to slow their breathing, trying to look normal. They ditched the weapons and the evidence, a frantic, clumsy attempt to cover their tracks. They drove to a local movie theater to establish their flimsy alibi, hoping the normalcy of a public place would wash the scent of blood off them. It was a pointless, desperate move, but they were operating on pure adrenaline and a script they'd hastily written. After the movie was supposedly over, they drove back to the house. The atmosphere inside the car was one of suffocating silence and mounting terror. They knew what was waiting for them, and they knew they had to perform. This was their Oscar moment. They pulled up the long driveway, and Lyle was the first to discover the scene. He ran to a phone and dialed 911, screaming, "Someone killed my parents." The tape of that 911 call would later become famous. Lyle's voice was high-pitched, hysterical, and laced with panic. It sounded exactly like the voice of a young man who had just discovered a tragedy. The performance was flawless, but under the surface, it was a terrifying calculation. Erik, arriving a moment later, began to cry and wail, his reaction equally dramatic, equally convincing. To the dispatcher, and soon to the responding officers, these were two traumatized sons. The Beverly Hills Police Department, BHPD, officers who arrived moments later were met with a scene of unimaginable gore. The den was a carnage. Jose had been shot multiple times. Kitty was barely recognizable. The immediate conclusion was that this was a professional execution, a mafia hit, or a robbery gone terribly wrong. Jose Menendez was a powerful man with complex business dealings, so this theory made immediate sense. The police noted the luxury of the house, the power of the victim, and the severity of the wounds. They also noted the two weeping boys. Lyle and Erik were questioned at the scene. They spoke of going to the movies, of coming home to find the horror. They gave an account of their parents' recent worries. Jose had been feeling pressure at work, and Kitty had been increasingly paranoid about intruders. The boys were articulate, cooperative, and seemed genuinely devastated. The police, following the leads of a professional killing, didn't immediately focus on the victim's sons. They offered condolences and let them go, assuming they were the only witnesses, not the perpetrators. But there were cracks in their story almost immediately. The police noticed that despite the brutality, nothing of value seemed to be missing from the house. A professional thief wouldn't pass up expensive jewelry and cash. Furthermore, the positioning of the bodies and the nature of the wounds suggested the victims had been completely taken by surprise, ambushed by someone they trusted. As the days turned into weeks, the focus of the investigation would slowly, inexorably, begin to shift. The grieving sons were about to become the prime suspects. The lie they had perfected in the heat of the moment was beginning to show fatal flaws. The funeral for Jose and Kitty Menendez was a massive affair, a spectacle of wealth and grief in equal measure. Lyle and Erik, dressed in expensive black suits, played their parts perfectly. They were the devastated orphans, leaning on each other for support, accepting condolences from Hollywood elites and powerful business partners. But behind the veil of tears and tragedy, a much more sinister transformation was taking place. The moment their parents were buried, the boys felt a rush of euphoria and freedom, a feeling so intoxicating that it blinded them to caution. Within days, the grief was completely forgotten, replaced by a frenzied, reckless celebration. They had access to their father's massive wealth, and they began spending it with an almost unbelievable lack of restraint. It was as if they were trying to buy back all the fun and freedom they felt their father's strict, controlling nature had denied them. The police were still investigating a complicated murder, looking for business enemies and professional killers, while Lyle and Erik were living like rock stars. Lyle, always the more assertive and demanding brother, was the first to dive in. He bought an expensive Porsche sports car and started buying up expensive properties. He opened a high-end restaurant in Princeton, New Jersey, called Chuck's Spring Street Cafe, trying to establish himself as a serious businessman overnight. The irony was suffocating. He was using his father's money to start the kind of ventures Jose would have meticulously scrutinized and probably forbidden. Erik, the quieter and more introverted brother, also indulged wildly, though in a slightly different way. He hired a full-time tennis coach, fulfilling his ambition to be a professional tennis player, showering him with gifts, cash, and even financing his travel. He also invested heavily in his own image, buying designer clothes, expensive jewelry, and throwing lavish, late-night parties at the now-empty mansion. The pool area, once the scene of strained family gatherings, became a nonstop carnival of young, beautiful people. Their spending was not discreet. It was loud, flashy, and happening right under the nose of the police investigation. They were flaunting millions of dollars just weeks after claiming to be traumatized victims of a violent crime. To the outside world, this sudden, aggressive joy looked crass. To the police, who were still baffled by the lack of missing valuables, it started to look highly suspicious. Why would two grieving sons, afraid of the killers still at large, immediately start living a life of conspicuous consumption? The detective overseeing the case, Les Zoller, began to feel a gnawing unease. Professional killers don't leave this kind of ambiguity, and professional victims don't act like this. The shift in the boys' behavior was too drastic, too immediate. They weren't just suspects anymore. They were practically inviting scrutiny with every new purchase. The spending spree wasn't a distraction. It was a gigantic, flashing arrow pointing directly at the two young men who claimed to have lost everything. They were proving that the only thing they had truly gained was the money, and they were already enjoying the spoils. While Lyle and Erik were busy celebrating their newfound freedom and wealth, the slow, methodical gears of the police investigation were turning. Detective Zoller, frustrated by the dead ends in Jose Menendez's business dealings, pivoted. He decided to take a hard look at the grieving sons. The massive spending was the first clue, but the police needed physical proof, not just bad behavior. The focus turned to their alibi, the movie they claimed to have watched. The brothers insisted they were at a theater in Santa Monica, watching the new James Bond film, License to Kill. This was their rock-solid timeline. They left home, watched the movie, and returned to find the bodies. Simple. However, when investigators checked the security footage and records from the theater, the details were fuzzy. More importantly, the timestamps didn't quite line up. The movie they claimed to have seen had an earlier start time than they admitted. If they had followed their timeline, they would have been leaving the theater right around the time the shots were actually fired at the house. Furthermore, a deeper look at the crime scene itself revealed something crucial that completely contradicted a robbery or hit: the placement of the shotgun shell casings. The police determined that the killers had reloaded the guns. This suggested that the perpetrators were not slick professionals. Professionals use automatic weapons and don't typically reload a shotgun inside the kill zone. This was a messy, personal crime driven by emotion, not a cold, precise execution. This reinforced the idea that the killers were amateurs, likely known to the victims, and possibly even family members. But the final, fatal crack in the alibi came from a completely unexpected place: the brothers' own vanity. Lyle, during one of his wild nights, had boasted about the murder to a friend. Though the friend didn't take it seriously at the time, the police were beginning to gather circumstantial evidence. They started planting seeds, subtly suggesting to the boys' friends and associates that they knew more than they were letting on. The police were also closing in on the fact that the brothers had purchased the two shotguns in San Diego, using a fabricated driver's license, barely a week before the murder. This key piece of evidence linked them directly to the means of the crime. The combined evidence, the frantic spending, the faulty alibi, the amateur nature of the killing, and the shotgun purchase, formed an inescapable web. The police were no longer looking for an outside killer. They now knew the true identity of the murderers. The stage was set for the one person Erik Menendez trusted, his therapist, to unknowingly become the state's key witness. The brothers' carefully constructed life was about to collapse. The weight of the secret was crushing Erik. He was the younger, more sensitive brother, and the heavy facade of the grieving son, combined with the guilt of the crime and the horror of the relentless spending spree, was tearing him apart. While Lyle seemed to thrive on the newfound freedom and wealth, Erik was retreating into a deep pool of depression and paranoia. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't enjoy the spoils. He felt like he was living in a $7 million tomb, constantly looking over his shoulder. The fear of being caught was far worse than the fear of his parents had ever been. His only outlet became his psychiatrist, Dr. L. Jerome Oziel. Erik had been seeing Dr. Oziel for therapy, and in the weeks following the murders, the sessions became increasingly intense and desperate. Erik, unable to bear the burden alone, began hinting at the dark truth. He spoke in riddles about a dark secret and a terrible act he was responsible for. Dr. Oziel, a successful Beverly Hills therapist, had no idea he was about to become the epicenter of a sensational murder case and the key witness against his own patient. On October 31st, 1989, Halloween night, Erik finally cracked. During a tear-filled, frantic session, Erik confessed everything. He told Dr. Oziel the whole story. The years of alleged abuse he and Lyle had suffered, the desperation, the plan they concocted, the purchase of the shotguns, the carnage in the den, and the subsequent cover-up. The sheer terror and remorse in Erik's voice were unmistakable. He wasn't boasting. He was begging for release from his own conscience. Dr. Oziel was immediately plunged into a profound ethical crisis. The confidentiality between a therapist and a patient is a sacred trust, heavily protected by law. But here was a confession to a double murder. Oziel had a legal duty to warn or protect others if a patient posed a future danger, but the threat was historical. The crime was already committed. However, the revelation was so enormous, so terrifying, and so impossible to ignore that it completely overwhelmed the boundaries of his practice. In a moment of catastrophic professional error and fear, Dr. Oziel secretly began recording some of his sessions with Erik. Furthermore, unbeknownst to Erik, the doctor was entangled in a volatile personal relationship with his mistress, Judalon Smith, who was also a patient. In a moment of sheer panic and professional uncertainty, Oziel shared the chilling details of Erik's confession with Smith. He played the tape of the confession, looking for advice or just a sounding board. This reckless breach of confidentiality, driven by the doctor's own stress and terror, would prove to be the critical error that sealed the brothers' fate. Smith, now privy to the most explosive secret in Beverly Hills, was armed with information that would shortly bring the entire house of lies crashing down. Dr. Oziel's fear wasn't unwarranted. He knew what powerful people the Menendez family were, and he knew how desperate the two young murderers were to keep their secret buried. He felt caught between professional ethics and sheer self-preservation. The confession to Dr. Oziel was supposed to be a private, cathartic release for Erik, but it quickly became the biggest threat to Lyle's freedom and his new millionaire lifestyle. When Erik tearfully told Lyle what he had done, confessing the entire truth of the murder to his psychiatrist, Lyle was consumed by a cold, immediate panic. He didn't share Erik's gnawing guilt. He only saw the existential risk to their carefully constructed plan. Lyle was furious with his younger brother for his weakness and his conscience. The problem wasn't the police anymore. The problem was the man who had the confession on tape and in his notes. Lyle immediately went into a terrifying damage control mode. He reached out to Dr. Oziel, not as a patient seeking help, but as a predator trying to eliminate a threat. Lyle's messages and phone calls were thinly veiled threats, warning the psychiatrist to stay silent, to keep the sacred promise of doctor-patient privilege, or face dire consequences. Lyle made it clear that he knew where Oziel lived and what he had on him. This act, attempting to intimidate a medical professional into silence, only served to deepen Dr. Oziel's own terror and guilt over his professional misconduct. It was Oziel's mistress, Judalon Smith, who ultimately broke the case open. After repeated, stressful fights with Dr. Oziel, fueled by his paranoia and the overwhelming pressure of holding the secret, Smith was terrified and fed up. She knew the secret was too big, too dark, and too dangerous to hold. She finally went to the police. She told the authorities everything. The chilling confession, the secret tape recordings, the detailed account of the shotgun murders, and Lyle's subsequent threats against the doctor. On March 5, 1990, she was brought in for a detailed interview, and her story was convincing. She provided inside information that only the killers or someone very close to them would possess. Detective Zoller and the BHPD immediately realized they had found their breakthrough. The circumstantial evidence, the shotgun purchases, the faulty alibi, the reckless spending spree, now had a full, detailed confession attached to it. The pieces clicked into place. The police quickly secured warrants, maneuvering around the sticky issues of therapist-patient privilege. Lyle was the first to be arrested on March 8, 1990, while visiting a friend in the prestigious Bel Air neighborhood. The police swooped in, ending his reign of reckless freedom and conspicuous consumption. Erik, who was away on a tennis trip in Israel, learned of his brother's arrest through the international news. His initial response was one of pure terror and a brief, doomed attempt at flight. He knew it was only a matter of time before they came for him. He returned to the States, and, just a few days after Lyle's arrest, on March 11, 1990, he turned himself in at Los Angeles International Airport. The arrest of the two well-heeled, young, and seemingly tragic orphans shocked the city of Beverly Hills and instantly propelled the case onto the national stage. The secret was out, and the next chapter would be a public spectacle of guilt, motive, and betrayal. The brothers who had planned the perfect murder were undone by their own overconfidence, Erik's conscience, and a therapist's catastrophic lapse in professional judgment. The party was officially over. With both Lyle and Erik Menendez in custody, the legal wheels began to turn with dizzying speed. The preliminary hearings quickly established the sheer weight of the evidence against them. The shotgun purchases, the faulty alibi, the damning confession to Dr. Oziel and its subsequent recording, and the staggering, reckless spending that followed the murders. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Pamela Bozanek, wasted no time in presenting a compelling narrative of greed-driven patricide. The motive, as painted by the prosecution, was simple and brutal: the $14 million inheritance. Jose Menendez had amassed a fortune as a successful entertainment executive, first at Live Entertainment and then at Carolco Pictures. His net worth, including the Beverly Hills mansion, luxury cars, and other assets, was substantial. Both boys were aware of this wealth, and according to the prosecution, they saw their parents as obstacles to immediate access to that fortune. The swift, unrestrained spending spree in the months after the murders served as irrefutable proof of their true intentions. They didn't just inherit money, they practically flaunted it in the faces of a grieving public. The brothers were formally indicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder each, with special circumstances. The special circumstances clauses were critical. They alleged that the murders were committed for financial gain and that multiple murders were committed, making the brothers eligible for the death penalty or life imprisonment without parole. This wasn't just a regular murder case. It was a high-stakes legal battle, a test of the justice system's ability to prosecute the privileged. However, the legal team for the Menendez brothers, initially led by lawyer Leslie Abramson, immediately challenged the admissibility of Dr. Oziel's testimony and the secret tape recordings. Abramson argued vehemently that the recordings were a clear breach of attorney-client privilege. She incorrectly used that term instead of therapist-patient privilege in public statements to gain sympathy, and that the doctor had acted unethically. This legal maneuvering would become a central battleground throughout the entire trial, raising complex questions about confidentiality, evidence, and professional conduct. While the lawyers fought over legal technicalities, the details of the inheritance began to emerge. Jose Menendez was a self-made man who had clawed his way to the top, known for his relentless ambition and iron-fisted control over his family's finances. Kitty, though a socialite, was equally possessive of their wealth. The prosecution argued that the boys chafed under their father's control, feeling suffocated and restricted despite their lavish lifestyle. The inheritance wasn't just money, it was freedom from their parents' oppressive grip. It was a golden ticket to a life unconstrained by rules, curfews, or expectations. The prosecution believed this desire for absolute freedom and access to wealth was the driving force behind the horrific crime, a cold, calculated decision made by 2 spoiled, entitled sons who wanted everything, right now. The arrest of Lyle and Erik Menendez didn't just make headlines. It exploded onto the national stage, creating a media frenzy unlike almost anything seen before. This wasn't just another murder. This was a story tailor-made for public consumption. 2 handsome, wealthy young men from Beverly Hills, who seemed to have everything, brutally murdering their powerful parents for money. It had all the ingredients: privilege, violence, sex. Rumors swirled about the brothers' personal lives, and a dramatic fall from grace. Cable news channels, still a relatively new phenomenon, were hungry for content, and the Menendez case provided a continuous, gripping narrative. Tabloid newspapers ran sensational headlines. Talk shows debated the motives. The image of the grieving sons quickly morphed into the evil heirs, a narrative that captivated and repulsed the nation in equal measure. Every detail, no matter how small or salacious, was scrutinized and broadcast. The early stages of the legal proceedings were open to the public, and the courtroom quickly became a circus. Reporters from around the world crammed into the benches, eager to catch every glance, every tear, every legal maneuver. News vans lined the streets outside the courthouse. Camera crews captured the brothers arriving and departing, their faces now instantly recognizable. The public became armchair detectives, dissecting every piece of information, forming strong opinions long before any verdict was reached. What fueled the frenzy was the seeming incomprehensibility of the crime. How could children, especially ones who had been given so much, commit such a heinous act against their own parents? Was it simply greed? Was it a breakdown of morality in an overly privileged society? The media presented these questions, allowing the public to project their own fears and fascinations onto the Menendez brothers. The defense, led by Leslie Abramson, understood the power of the media and tried to use it to their advantage, albeit carefully. While the prosecution focused on the cold, hard facts of the crime and the motive of greed, the defense began to subtly hint at a deeper, darker backstory. They knew that to counter the evil heir's narrative, they needed a more sympathetic, even shocking, explanation for the brothers' actions. They knew they had to shift the public perception from calculating killers to traumatized victims. This media saturation had a profound impact on the legal process. It meant that potential jurors were exposed to a constant barrage of information, much of it biased, long before they ever stepped into a courtroom. It also put immense pressure on the judges, lawyers, and even the brothers themselves. Their lives were no longer private. They were a public spectacle, and the world was watching, waiting to see how this tragic, compelling drama would unfold. The trial hadn't even truly begun, but the court of public opinion had already delivered its initial, damning verdict. As the case moved closer to trial, the defense team, anchored by the formidable Leslie Abramson, knew they had an uphill battle. The evidence of financial motive, the shotgun purchases, and the confession tape were overwhelming. To have any chance of saving the Menendez brothers from the death penalty, Abramson needed to completely reframe the narrative. She had to pivot the story from one of greedy killers to one of desperate victims. The only way to achieve this was to introduce the defense of abuse. Abramson alleged that the privileged facade of the Menendez family hid a terrifying reality. She claimed that Jose and Kitty were not merely strict parents, but abusive tyrants. The defense asserted that Jose Menendez had subjected both Lyle and Erik to years of severe physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, and that Kitty, their mother, was complicit in the abuse, either by participating or by remaining silent. According to this new narrative, the murders were not a cold, calculated act of greed, but a tragic result of self-defense, or at least, a crime committed in the heat of passion fueled by years of trauma. The brothers, Abramson argued, had lived in constant fear of their father, believing that he was capable of killing them if they ever revealed his secret. The inheritance, the defense claimed, was not the motive was survival. This strategy was a massive gamble. The public found it almost impossible to believe that a wealthy, successful entertainment executive could be a monstrous abuser. It flew in the face of the image the family had projected for years. However, Abramson hammered home the point that abuse often hides behind closed doors and that the wealthiest families are often the best at maintaining a flawless public image. She introduced testimony from psychiatrists and psychologists who supported the theory of battered child syndrome. They argued that Lyle and Erik suffered from deep psychological damage, leading them to believe that on the night of August 20th, 1989, their lives were in imminent danger. The defense posited that the brothers misinterpreted an argument or a confrontation that night as a signal that Jose was finally going to kill them, forcing them to strike first. This shift in focus was incredibly powerful and profoundly controversial. It forced the prosecution to defend the deceased parents and grapple with the difficult and proven allegations of long-term sexual abuse. It allowed the defense to bring forth the brothers' tearful, often highly dramatic testimony about the horrors they claimed to have endured. Lyle and Erik, who had initially been portrayed as monsters, were now asking the jury to see them as products of their parents' cruelty, desperately fighting back against years of psychological torture. This narrative gave the jurors an alternative explanation, a small sliver of reasonable doubt, and became the cornerstone of their entire defense. The first trial began in 1993, and it immediately became a legal circus televised daily on court TV. Judge Stanley Weisberg presided over the proceedings, which were dominated by the clash between the prosecution's narrative of greed and the defense's narrative of self-defense and abuse. The prosecution, led by Pamela Bozanik, presented a meticulous case, focusing on the financial motive. They showed the purchase of the shotguns, the careful timing of the crime, the immediate, frantic spending on Porsches and restaurants, and the damning details of the confession. They ridiculed the idea that the boys, who had fled the scene to go watch a movie, could possibly have been acting in self-defense. If they were truly terrified and acting in the heat of the moment, why the premeditation, why the cleanup, and why the celebration afterward? The emotional peak of the defense's case came when Lyle and Erik took the stand. They cried openly and described in agonizing detail the alleged sexual abuse by their father and the indifference of their mother. Erik, in particular, was the most convincing. He was visibly distraught, often breaking down into uncontrollable sobs while describing the terror he felt and the feeling of hopelessness that led to the murders. Lyle's testimony was more complex. While he also described the abuse, he maintained a more controlled, almost legalistic demeanor, which some observers found less credible than Erik's raw emotion. However, he emphasized the controlling nature of his father, stating that they felt trapped with no way out. The judge made a crucial ruling regarding the abuse. While he allowed the defense to present evidence of alleged abuse to explain the brothers' state of mind and why they felt they had to strike first, he did not allow it to be considered as a direct defense of justifiable homicide, meaning the defense could not argue that the murder itself was justified as legal self-defense, only that the abuse may have driven the boys to the crime. The trial lasted for months, and the jurors, sequestered and forced to listen to the horrifying testimony and complex psychological arguments, became deeply divided. There was an element of sympathy for the boys based on the abuse claims, but also a strong sense that the murders were still a cold, planned execution for money. The final result was a stunning and unprecedented conclusion: 2 hung juries. The jury for Lyle was deadlocked, unable to agree whether he was a cold-blooded killer or a terrorized victim. The jury for Erik also could not reach a unanimous verdict. In essence, the defense's strategy had worked. They had successfully introduced enough reasonable doubt about the motive and the mental state of the defendants to prevent a conviction. The state was forced to declare a mistrial, meaning the entire sensational case would have to be tried all over again. The declaration of a mistrial in early 1994 was a massive, though temporary, victory for the Menendez brothers and their defense team. But the prosecution, smarting from the setback and convinced of the brothers' guilt, was determined to succeed the second time around. The state immediately announced that they would retry the case. The most crucial difference in the second trial, which began in late 1995, was the complete absence of cameras. The first trial had been a public spectacle, a continuous source of sensational entertainment, which many legal experts believe pressured the jury and may have led to the emotionally charged, divided verdicts. The new presiding judge, Lance Ito, famous for overseeing the O.J. Simpson trial, which was happening concurrently, severely restricted media access, hoping to create a more controlled and sober environment for the jury. The narrative was no longer being shaped daily by television commentary and public opinion, forcing the second jury to focus only on the facts presented in the courtroom. The prosecution also changed its strategy, making it more focused and ruthless. Deputy District Attorney David Kahn took the lead for the state, alongside Pamela Bozanik. They learned from the first trial that the emotional testimony about abuse was devastatingly effective. Therefore, they decided to directly counter the abuse allegations by painting Jose Menendez as a strict, demanding parent, but vehemently denying the claims of sexual abuse. They presented witnesses who attested to Jose's generosity and control, but argued that the abuse claims were a manufactured defense, a desperate lie to avoid a death sentence. The defense, still led by the fiery Leslie Abramson, essentially repeated the same strategy, emphasizing the years of trauma and the resulting state of mind that led to the murders. However, without the emotional pressure of the cameras, the jury was less likely to be swayed by the dramatic tears and highly charged emotional breakdowns that had been so effective the first time. The focus shifted from the brothers' feelings to the facts of premeditation. A major strategic improvement by the prosecution was to highlight the planning. They spent considerable time showing how the boys had scouted locations for the shotgun purchase, how they had created a specific alibi, and how they had meticulously cleaned up the crime scene. They argued that if the boys had truly acted in a sudden, panicked moment of self-defense, there would be no evidence of planning, no alibi creation, and certainly no celebratory spending spree immediately afterward. The new, quieter setting allowed the prosecution's methodical logic to take root, making the narrative of cold, calculated greed much harder for the jury to ignore. The central, most explosive piece of evidence in the entire case remained the confession to Dr. L. Jerome Oziel. The legal battle over its admissibility had been fierce and complex since the start, directly challenging the sanctity of the patient psychotherapist privilege. In the first trial, the judge had allowed the confession but placed significant restrictions on how it could be used. For the second trial, the legal landscape had shifted decisively in the prosecution's favor. After extensive appeals and legal rulings, the court definitively ruled that the recordings and Dr. Oziel's testimony were admissible in full. The justification was twofold. First, the court ruled that the privilege did not apply because Lyle had threatened Dr. Oziel, which demonstrated an intent to commit a crime, obstructing justice, overriding the confidentiality. Second, the court ruled that the death of a patient exception applied, where information about a crime is necessary for justice. This was the final, devastating blow to the defense's secrecy strategy. When Dr. Oziel took the stand, the entire dynamic of the trial changed. For the first time, the jury heard a detailed, chilling, and medically documented account of Erik's confession. Oziel testified to the absolute terror Erik expressed, but also the clarity of the plan. He recounted Erik's words about the purchase of the shotguns, the cleaning of the scene, and the initial feeling of relief, followed by overwhelming guilt. This was direct evidence of guilt, coming from a professional witness who had no financial stake in the outcome. The defense's only recourse was to attack Dr. Oziel's credibility. Leslie Abramson relentlessly cross-examined him, highlighting his affair with Judalon Smith, the initial illegal secret recordings, and his general unprofessional conduct. She tried to portray him as a manipulative, unethical, and self-serving individual who had betrayed his patient for fame and self-preservation. However, the weight of the confession itself was too heavy. The jury was now faced with the direct, recorded words of one of the perpetrators. While the defense could argue that the murders were a result of abuse, the testimony about the pre-planning, the alibi, and the subsequent cover-up proved the element of premeditation, the crucial component needed for first-degree murder. This was the difference-maker. The story was no longer just about the son's trauma. It was about their calculated actions. The admissibility of the Oziel testimony sealed the brothers' fate, removing any ambiguity the first jury had grappled with. After weeks of testimony, which was less sensational than the first trial, but far more focused on the evidence of premeditation, the case was finally handed over to the jury. The jury in the second trial was not televised, ensuring a greater degree of privacy and, arguably, less emotional influence. They were instructed by Judge Lance Ito to consider the law rigorously, focusing on the elements of first-degree murder, which required intent and premeditation. They had to weigh the prosecution's evidence of greed and planning against the defense's argument of a response to long-term abuse. The deliberations lasted for over a week. The new jury, having been shielded from the overwhelming media commentary and the emotional theatrics of the first trial, was seemingly less susceptible to the abuse defense. They were highly focused on the purchase of the shotguns, the alibi, the cleanup, and the immediate spending spree, all evidence that screamed premeditation, not a sudden, panicked reaction to immediate danger. On July 2, 1996, the verdict was finally reached. The two brothers, Lyle and Erik, were led back into the silent courtroom. The moment was tense, the atmosphere thick with years of drama and legal maneuvering. They stood side by side, awaiting their fate, their faces showing a mixture of exhaustion and fear. The clerk read the verdicts. For Lyle Menendez, guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. For Erik Menendez, guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The verdict was a resounding victory for the prosecution. The first-degree conviction meant the jury believed the murders were planned and committed with malice aforethought, rejecting the defense's claim of self-defense or manslaughter. The brothers were also found guilty of the special circumstance of murder for financial gain, making the maximum sentence either life without parole or the death penalty. Lyle and Erik showed little visible reaction, though their faces visibly hardened. Leslie Abramson, their lawyer, was visibly angry and immediately vowed to appeal. Outside the courtroom, the reaction was immediate and enormous. Despite the media blackout, the news spread like wildfire. The public, which had been deeply divided during the first trial, now largely accepted the judgment. The narrative of the greedy, spoiled rich kids who killed for money had finally triumphed over the narrative of the abused victims. For the families of Jose and Kitty, particularly Kitty's side, there was a sense of profound, albeit painful, closure. Justice, they felt, had finally been served for the brutal deaths of their loved ones. The case, which had been a symbol of the dark side of American wealth and privilege, had finally reached its legal conclusion. The perfect lie the brothers had created on that August night in 1989 was irrevocably shattered. The sentencing phase followed the guilty verdict. Given the special circumstances, murder for financial gain and multiple murders, the brothers faced two possible sentences: life without the possibility of parole or the death penalty. The prosecution argued fiercely for the death penalty, citing the cold, calculated nature of the crime and the spectacular lack of remorse demonstrated by the post-murder spending spree. The defense, however, made a powerful final plea based on the years of alleged abuse, arguing that even if the jury found the crime was premeditated, the brothers' troubled childhood and psychological damage warranted mercy. Leslie Abramson presented a powerful, final portrait of two young men who had been warped by a horrifying upbringing. On July 2, 1996, Judge Stanley Weisberg, who had presided over the preliminary stages and now returned for sentencing, delivered the final judgment. He acknowledged the alleged history of abuse but concluded that the evidence of premeditation and financial motive was too strong to warrant anything less than the severest penalty short of death. Lyle and Erik Menendez were each sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for the murders of their parents. The sentencing was a definitive closure to the Menendez saga. It meant that the two boys who had grown up in the lap of luxury would spend the rest of their lives within the confines of the California penal system. Their initial years in prison were marked by attempts to maintain a semblance of control and connection. Due to the high-profile nature of their case and security concerns, the brothers were initially separated. Lyle was sent to Mule Creek State Prison, and Erik to Folsom State Prison, ensuring they could not communicate directly. A cruel twist for two brothers who had only ever truly relied on each other, for better or for worse. In the years that followed, both brothers got married while in prison. Lyle married twice, first to a former model and then to a magazine editor. Erik married a childhood pen pal. These marriages were controversial, viewed by critics as just another attempt to manipulate public sympathy and maintain a connection to the outside world, a final grasp at normalcy in an utterly abnormal existence. Despite their physical separation, the two brothers remained inextricably linked in the public mind and in their own fate. They both maintained that the murders were a desperate act of self-defense, even as they languished in prison. Their appeals were consistently denied, and the legal door to freedom was permanently closed. Their life behind bars became a stark contrast to the life of endless possibilities they had killed to possess. They traded a mansion for a cell, and a fortune for a lifetime of regret and infamy. Decades have passed since the shocking murders of Jose and Kitty Menendez, but the story refuses to fade. It remains a fixture in American true crime, a case constantly revisited by documentaries, podcasts, and new generations of armchair observers. The legacy of the Menendez brothers is one of enduring ambiguity. Were they monstrous, greedy killers who invented a shocking tale of abuse to save their own lives? Or were they truly the victims of a dark, closed-off family who finally snapped under unbearable pressure? The public, and even the brothers themselves, continue to grapple with this dichotomy. In the years following their conviction, both Lyle and Erik continued their lives within the California prison system, maintaining an extraordinary degree of media attention. They became symbols of how wealth and privilege can sometimes shield the darkest of secrets, only to have them brutally exposed in a public courtroom. Their story resonated with deep societal fears about family dysfunction, the reliability of authority figures like therapists, and the idea that behind the perfect facade of the elite, profound cruelty can exist. In 2017, a significant change finally occurred. After years of separation, Lyle and Erik were reunited. Lyle was transferred to the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility where Erik was already incarcerated. The brothers, who had been separated for over 20 years, were finally placed in the same prison facility. This reunion was deeply meaningful to them, as they had always maintained that they were each other's only true family. For two men facing life without parole, being able to see and speak to each other offered a small measure of human comfort. However, the question of their freedom has never truly been resolved for them. Despite the multiple life sentences, both brothers have periodically sought parole. Their claims in these hearings remained consistent. The murders were not for greed, but were a preemptive act of self-preservation driven by the cumulative trauma of abuse. They point to the vast psychological evidence presented at trial and their seemingly flawless behavior behind bars as proof of their rehabilitation. They have embraced Christianity and counseling, trying to demonstrate that the dangerous young men who committed the crime no longer exist. But the parole boards, reflecting the court's final judgment, consistently reject their bids. The element of premeditation, the purchase of the shotguns, the cleanup, the carefully constructed alibi, and the subsequent massive spending is seen as insurmountable evidence of their true, cold motive, financial gain. Their crimes were not sudden acts of passion but a planned execution, and for that, the legal system has determined their sentence must be permanent. The legacy of the Menendez brothers remains a cautionary tale about the corrosive power of secrets, money, and control. The wealth they killed for was lost almost immediately to legal fees and restitution. The freedom they craved was replaced by concrete walls and iron bars. They lived their lives as a permanent warning from behind prison glass. Two brothers who, on one hot August night, chose the path of ultimate destruction, trading a life of gilded misery for a lifetime of inescapable consequence. And so, we close the book on the Menendez murders. It's a story that starts with a nightmare of a crime in a Beverly Hills mansion and ends in the cold, unforgiving reality of a prison cell. The tragedy here isn't just the brutal slaying of Jose and Kitty, but the total destruction of a family. A destruction wrought by years of dark secrets and culminating in a desperate, deadly act of violence and betrayal. We're left with that haunting question. Were Lyle and Erik Menendez victims who snapped, or cold-blooded murderers motivated by a multi-million-dollar inheritance? There's no easy answer, and maybe that's why this case continues to grip us, forcing us to look at the ugly truth that sometimes the monster is already inside the house. What do you think their true motivation was? Let us know in the comments below. If this deep dive into true crime held you captivated, please hit that like button, comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories just like this one.